Remember 2008? The crisis that almost destroyed the world? What if everything had gone differently back then? Today, we're diving into a terrifying scenario of economic collapse that we miraculously avoided. Imagine, in late 2008, instead of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, and subsequent interventions, Congress, swayed by powerful voices arguing against socialism for the rich and advocating for pure free market principles, votes down all bailout proposals. The administration, despite its own concerns, bows to this legislative will, believing that the pain of a market correction, however severe, is ultimately necessary for long-term health. The immediate impact would be catastrophic. Without government intervention, the financial sector experiences a cascading failure. Lehman Brothers is just the first domino. Other major investment banks, insurance giants like AIG, and even large commercial banks quickly follow, collapsing under the weight of toxic assets and a frozen credit market. The interbank lending market completely seizes up. No bank trusts another, so money stops flowing. The initial shock of Lehman Brothers' collapse in our timeline was a tremor. In this alternate reality, it's the first crack in a dam that completely bursts. Without the Treasury and the Federal Reserve stepping in, the contagion spreads with terrifying speed and ferocity. Beyond Lehman, the likes of Merrill Lynch, which was hastily acquired by Bank of America in our timeline, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs would find themselves in untenable positions. Merrill Lynch, facing similar exposure to subprime mortgages and illiquid assets, would likely follow Lehman into bankruptcy. Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, perhaps more agile, might try to find desperate buyers, but with credit markets frozen and no government backstop, their value would plummet to near zero. Their vast derivatives portfolios, once a source of profit, would become a black hole, sucking in what little capital they had left. The complex web of counterparty risk means that the failure of one major player immediately drags down dozens of others. Every bank, hedge fund, and pension fund with exposure to these collapsing giants would face immense pressure, leading to a wave of secondary failures. The collapse wouldn't be confined to the investment banking world. Large commercial banks like Citigroup, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, heavily exposed to the collapsing housing market and interbank lending, would face massive runs. Depositors, gripped by panic, would rush to withdraw their money, emptying ATMs and bank branches. Without the FDIC's solvency guaranteed by the Treasury, deposit insurance would prove insufficient against widespread panic. We would see lines stretching around blocks, not for food, but for people desperately trying to access their life savings. Many regional and local banks, already vulnerable, would fail within days or weeks, taking with them small business loans and community savings. The entire banking infrastructure, from the smallest credit union to the largest international institution, would be compromised, leading to a complete breakdown of payment systems. Checks would bounce, debit cards would be declined, and the very concept of money stored electronically would be questioned. Beyond traditional banks, the vast and often opaque shadow banking system, comprising money market funds, hedge funds, and investment vehicles that operate outside traditional banking regulations, would also disintegrate. These entities relied heavily on short-term funding markets and complex securitization. With trust gone and no liquidity, these markets would completely seize up. Money market funds, once considered safe havens, would break the buck, meaning their net asset value would fall below $1 per share, triggering mass redemptions and further destabilizing short-term funding for corporations. Giants like AIG, crucial providers of credit default swaps, CDS, that essentially ensured complex mortgage-backed securities, would default on their obligations. In our timeline, AIG's bailout was almost as controversial as the bank bailouts due to its sheer scale and the perceived moral hazard. Without that intervention, AIG's collapse would trigger hundreds of billions, if not trillions, in losses across the global financial system, as banks, pension funds, and corporations that bought CDS from AIG would find their insurance worthless. This would be a second wave of financial contagion, impacting even seemingly healthy institutions. This is the most insidious and far-reaching consequence. When financial institutions don't trust each other, they stop lending. This extends beyond interbank lending to all forms of credit. Corporations, even profitable ones, rely on short-term loans for everyday operations to pay employees, purchase inventory, or manage cash flow. With no credit available, businesses of all sizes, from multinational corporations to local diners, would be forced to shut down operations. Supply chains would collapse as companies couldn't finance raw materials or finished goods. Trade finance, the lifeblood of international commerce, would simply cease to exist. The financial collapse would not merely spill over into the real economy, it would drag it down into a suffocating abyss. The Great Recession of our timeline would seem like a mild downturn by comparison. In this alternate reality, unemployment numbers would be staggering. Millions of businesses, unable to access credit or facing plummeting demand, would lay off workers en masse. Manufacturing would halt, retail would empty, and service industries would vanish. We're talking about unemployment rates reaching 25 to 30% or even higher, echoing the darkest days of the Great Depression. This isn't just a statistic. It's a profound societal wound, meaning countless shattered lives, deserted homes, and cities turning into ghosts. Families would lose their income, their homes, and their sense of purpose. Food banks would be overwhelmed, and basic necessities would become luxuries for many. Already reeling from the subprime mortgage crisis, the housing market would face a complete collapse. Without banks to refinance mortgages or to lend for new purchases, property values would plummet to unprecedented lows, perhaps 50 to 70% below their peak. Millions more would find themselves underwater on their mortgages, owing far more than their homes were worth. With mass unemployment, foreclosures would surge, leading to widespread evictions and homelessness. Shantytowns, reminiscent of Hoovervilles from the 1930s, might reappear on the outskirts of major cities. The dream of homeownership, once central to the American identity, would be shattered for a generation, becoming a symbol of loss and despair. The stock market wouldn't just crash, it would evaporate. Trillions in retirement savings, college funds, and personal investments would be wiped out. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which fell significantly in our timeline, might plummet by 70 to 80% or more, taking decades to recover, if ever. This wouldn't just impact the wealthy, it would decimate the retirement plans of middle-class families who had diligently saved through 401ks and IRAs. The sense of financial security, painstakingly built over lifetimes, would vanish in an instant. With the financial system seizing up, traditional electronic payments and credit would become unreliable. People would resort to cash transactions for basic needs, if they could even get cash from broken ATMs or defunct banks. Barter economies might emerge in local communities, exchanging goods and services directly. This would represent a dramatic rollback of decades of financial innovation and convenience, forcing society to adapt to a much more primitive economic existence. The economic cataclysm would rip through the social fabric of the United States, creating deep scars that would last for generations. Trust, the invisible glue of society, would shatter. Trust in financial institutions, once seen as pillars of stability, would evaporate. Trust in corporations, perceived as having caused the crisis, would plummet. And perhaps most dangerously, trust in the government, seen as either unwilling or unable to protect its citizens, would reach extreme levels. This erosion of faith would make any attempts at recovery incredibly difficult, as people would be deeply cynical of any proposed solutions. The sheer scale of job losses, homelessness, and wealth destruction would inevitably lead to widespread social unrest. Protests, riots, and perhaps even localized acts of rebellion would become common as people vent their anger and desperation. Political polarization, already high in 2008, would intensify dramatically. Blame would be assigned relentlessly. Was it the fault of greedy bankers, incompetent politicians, or the fundamental flaws of capitalism itself? Ideologies would clash violently, with calls for radical systemic change gaining traction. We might see the rise of powerful populist movements from both the far left and far right, promising to dismantle the old order and rebuild society from scratch, potentially leading to a period of intense political instability and civil strife. For young people entering the workforce during this period, opportunities would be virtually non-existent. Their career trajectories would be permanently stunted, leading to a lost generation burdened by debt, unemployment, and a profound sense of disillusionment. The psychological toll of such sustained economic hardship would be immense, contributing to increased rates of depression, anxiety, and social fragmentation. The crisis would fundamentally alter American values. The pursuit of material wealth and the American dream of home ownership and upward mobility would be shattered for many. This could lead to a shift towards frugality, self-sufficiency, and community resilience. Perhaps a do-it-yourself culture would flourish out of necessity, with people learning to grow their own food, repair their own belongings, and rely more on local networks than on distant corporations or institutions. This could be a silver lining, a return to simpler, more communal ways of life, but born out of immense suffering. With jobs scarce and opportunities non-existent in many areas, we would likely see mass internal migration. People would abandon failing cities and regions in search of any available work, putting immense strain on the few areas that might offer some glimmer of hope. This could lead to demographic shifts, further straining public services in certain regions while others become depopulated. International emigration, particularly among those with skills or connections abroad, would also increase dramatically as people seek opportunities in more stable economies, further exacerbating the brain drain from the U.S. The U.S. economy, as the largest in the world and the linchpin of the global financial system, would not collapse in isolation. Its implosion would send shockwaves across every continent, triggering a great global depression. Global trade relies on complex financial mechanisms, letters of credit, trade finance, and currency exchange. With the U.S. financial system in ruins, these mechanisms would seize up. U.S. demand for foreign goods would plummet, devastating export-oriented economies in Asia and Europe. Conversely, foreign demand for U.S. goods would also fall due to global economic contraction. Supply chains already fragile would completely unravel, leading to shortages of critical goods worldwide. This would be far worse than the trade disruptions of the Great Depression, as the global economy in 2008 was far more interconnected. European banks, heavily exposed to U.S. mortgage-backed securities and interbank lending, would face similar crises. The Eurozone, already grappling with sovereign debt issues, would likely fracture under the strain, potentially leading to the collapse of the euro. Emerging markets, reliant on foreign direct investment and access to global capital markets, would be cut off entirely. Their currencies would devalue rapidly, leading to hyperinflation and widespread poverty. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank would be overwhelmed, unable to provide meaningful relief against such a widespread collapse. Economic hardship breeds political instability. Governments worldwide would face immense pressure from their struggling populations. We could see a rise in protectionism and nationalism as countries turn inward, attempting to shield their own economies from the global storm. International cooperation would likely break down, leading to increased tensions and conflicts over dwindling resources and trade routes. The geopolitical landscape would be dramatically reshaped, potentially leading to the rise of new global powers or a retreat into regional blocs. The influence of the US on the world stage would severely diminish, creating a power vacuum that other nations might attempt to fill, perhaps leading to new alliances and rivalries. Countries reliant on remittances from workers abroad, foreign aid, or commodity exports would be hit hardest. Their already fragile economies would disintegrate, leading to widespread famine, social unrest, and humanitarian crises. The progress made in poverty reduction over decades would be reversed, plunging hundreds of millions back into extreme poverty. The U.S. political system, already strained, would buckle under the weight of such an unprecedented economic catastrophe. The immediate aftermath would be characterized by extreme political gridlock. Congress, having rejected the bailouts, would find itself deeply divided. Hardline free market ideologues would double down, arguing that the pain, while extreme, was a necessary cleansing. Others would demand radical government intervention, blaming market fundamentalism for the disaster. This ideological chasm would paralyze legislative action, preventing any coherent response to the deepening crisis. The executive branch, under President Bush and later President Obama, would be largely impotent, unable to rally congressional support for effective measures. Their approval ratings would plummet, leading to a profound crisis of legitimacy for the entire federal government. In the void of effective governance, extremist movements would flourish. On the far right, anti-government militias and secessionist groups, fueled by distrust and a sense of betrayal, would gain significant traction. They might advocate for a complete dismantling of federal power, a return to gold standards, or even regional autonomy. On the far left, socialist and even communist ideologies, long marginalized in mainstream American politics, would find renewed appeal among those disillusioned by capitalism's perceived failure. Calls for nationalization of industries, radical wealth redistribution, and a complete overhaul of the economic system would become widespread. These groups would clash, not just politically, but potentially violently, further destabilizing the nation. The sustained economic hardship and political infighting could severely erode faith in democratic institutions themselves. Voter turnout might plummet as people become cynical about the political process, or conversely, hyper-mobilized by extremist factions. The pressure for quick, decisive solutions could lead to a flirtation with authoritarian figures promising stability, even at the cost of civil liberties. The very foundations of American democracy would be tested like never before. Without federal aid or a functioning banking system, state and local governments would face massive budget shortfalls. Essential services, policing, fire departments, schools, and public health would be severely cut or cease to exist in many areas. This would create a patchwork of desperate, self-reliant communities, further fragmenting the national identity and fostering regional rivalries. Some states might even attempt to issue their own currencies or develop local economic systems, leading to a de facto dissolution of the National Economic Union. The economic collapse would cast a long shadow over technological innovation and the very trajectory of social development. Innovation requires investment, both from corporations and venture capitalists. In a world gripped by depression, companies would slash R&D budgets to survive, focusing solely on core operations. Venture capital, the lifeblood of startups, would dry up almost completely as investors become extremely risk-averse. Many promising technologies that were on the cusp of breakthrough in our timeline might never materialize or would be severely delayed. The rapid advancements we've seen in areas like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, renewable energy, and space exploration would be significantly hampered. Scientists and engineers might struggle to find funding for their research, and the talent pipeline would suffer as fewer people pursue careers in STEM fields due to lack of opportunity. The gig economy, digital services, and other tech-driven phenomena that emerged in our timeline might emerge much later, or in different forms, shaped by a population with far less disposable income and greater economic anxiety. The focus would shift from disruptive innovation to basic survival and cost-cutting. Industries that thrived on consumer spending, easy credit, or global supply chains would be decimated. The automotive industry, which received a bailout in our timeline, would likely collapse entirely, taking with it millions of jobs and impacting countless related industries. Airlines, tourism, and luxury goods would face similar fates. This would lead to a dramatic restructuring of the global economy, with a greater emphasis on essential goods and services, local production, and resource efficiency born out of necessity. The experience of a deep depression would instill a profound sense of caution and risk aversion in society. People would prioritize stability and security over growth and ambition. There might be a greater emphasis on communal living, mutual aid, and sustainable practices, not out of ideological choice, but out of grim necessity. The role of government might shift dramatically, with calls for either much stronger central control to prevent future collapses, or a complete dismantling of government to allow true free markets to prevail. The ultimate outcome depending on which ideological faction gains power. Education, a pathway to opportunity in our timeline, would become a luxury, further entrenching social stratification. The quality of public education would plummet, and access to higher education would become incredibly limited, creating a permanent underclass with little hope of upward mobility. This would create a society far more rigid and stratified than anything seen in modern American history. The Great Global Depression of this alternate reality would not simply be a deep recession. It would be a fundamental reordering of the world. Economic recovery, if it ever truly happened, would be painfully slow. The deep scars of unemployment, debt, and lost trust would take decades, perhaps even a century to heal. The concept of continuous economic growth, a cornerstone of post-World War II prosperity, might be abandoned in favor of basic stability and survival. This would be a world defined by scarcity, not abundance. The massive economic downturn would drastically reduce energy demand. This could lead to a collapse in oil prices, hurting oil-producing nations. Investment in new energy technologies, including renewables, would likely slow to a crawl due to lack of capital and risk aversion. However, the crisis might also spur local, decentralized energy solutions as communities try to become self-sufficient, a bottom-up energy revolution born of desperation rather than policy. The significant weakening of the U.S. would create a power vacuum, while other major economies would also suffer. Some, particularly those less integrated into the Western financial system or those with more state control over their economies, might weather the storm relatively better. China, for example, might emerge as a more dominant global player much sooner, potentially setting the stage for a multipolar world order with very different values and priorities. Regional powers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America might also gain more autonomy, creating a truly fractured and unpredictable international system. The trust in global institutions and interconnectedness would be shattered. Nations would retreat behind protectionist barriers, prioritizing domestic production and self-sufficiency. International travel and migration would drastically decrease. This would lead to a far less interconnected world, with regional blocs and bilateral agreements replacing the broad multilateralism of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The very idea of a global village would be seen as a dangerous relic of a bygone era. For nations like Ukraine, already navigating complex geopolitical and economic landscapes, such a global depression would be catastrophic. Foreign investment, which was crucial for post-Soviet transition economies, would vanish entirely. Remittances from abroad, a lifeline for many families, would dry up as workers in developed nations lost their jobs. Demand for key Ukrainian exports, like agricultural products and metals, would plummet, crippling vital industries. The potential for social unrest and political instability within Ukraine would be dramatically heightened, possibly leading to a complete collapse of state functions or renewed conflicts, exacerbated by a world too preoccupied with its own survival to offer aid or stability. The path towards European integration and democratic reforms would be completely derailed, replaced by a desperate struggle for basic survival and self-preservation. A critical, often overlooked aspect of such a collapse would be the breakdown of public health and safety infrastructure. With state and local budgets decimated, hospitals would struggle to remain open, leading to a rise in preventable diseases and a decline in overall public health. Emergency services, including police and fire departments, would be severely underfunded, impacting response times and increasing crime rates. This decay would make daily life precarious and further erode civic order. The psychological toll of living in constant insecurity with limited access to healthcare and a heightened risk of crime would be profound, perpetuating cycles of despair and social breakdown. Trust in public institutions, already low, would vanish, replaced by a sense of every person for themselves. In this what-if world, the principle of non-intervention taken to its extreme leads to a global economic catastrophe of unprecedented scale. It's a world where the system was allowed to correct itself, but the cost was profound human suffering, a lost generation of wealth, and a dramatically reshaped geopolitical and social landscape. The Great Recession of our timeline, with all its pain, would be remembered as a mere ripple compared to the tsunami of destruction that would have engulfed the world. This is a future where the echoes of 2008 would reverberate for centuries, a stark reminder of the fragile balance between market forces and the desperate need for human intervention. So what do you think? Was the 2008 bailout a necessary evil that saved us from the abyss? Or would a harsh but creative destructive approach ultimately have made the economy stronger? What consequences, in your opinion, would have been the most terrifying? And how would this world have truly impacted everyday life in Ukraine, far from the epicenter? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this terrifying journey into an alternate economic past gripped your imagination, give us a like and subscribe for more what-if scenarios that make you look at our world with fresh eyes. Like, what if the internet never existed?